Imagine Egypt, thousands of years ago, sun-baked and shimmering, with towering temples and statues that seemed to touch the sky. For over a millennium, the people had prayed to many gods, each with their own stories, powers, and rituals. Life was predictable. The Nile would flood, the crops would grow, and the Pharaoh, believed to be half human and half divine, kept order in this world and the next. But then, suddenly, everything changed. There was a young pharaoh named Akhenaten. He wasn't supposed to be king at first, but fate had other plans. He looked at the world around him, all the old customs, the endless ceremonies, the power of the priests, and he saw something different. He wondered, what if there was just one God? Not a hidden one, nor a fierce animal-headed god, but the sun itself, the Aten. The sun's rays touched everyone, rich or poor, powerful or humble. To Akhenaten, maybe the sun seemed honest in a way that nothing else was. So, in a move that no one expected, Akhenaten set aside the gods his ancestors had worshipped for so many generations. He closed their temples, erased their names from monuments, and told everyone that Aten, the sun disk, was the only true god. You can imagine the shock. It would be like waking up to find out that everything you've believed your whole life was suddenly wrong, and the king himself was telling you so. But why did he do it? Was Akhenaten a dreamer, hoping to bring people together under one simple truth? Or was he so convinced of his own vision that he couldn't see the chaos it would bring? Some say he was a spiritual rebel. Others whisper he was just stubborn, maybe even out of touch. What's truly fascinating is how quickly his memory faded after he died. Later rulers tried to erase every trace of him. Statues smashed, names scratched out, his city left to crumble in the desert. It's almost as if Egypt wanted to forget he had ever existed, and yet his story survived, hidden in ruins, in half-buried statues with strange faces, in the mysteries that archaeologists are still trying to solve today. Did you know, for example, that some scientists think Akhenaten's odd appearance in art, his long face, thin arms, and rounded belly, might have been because of a rare genetic condition? It's one of those little details that keeps historians arguing even now. So, as we travel back in time together, think about this. What would drive someone to challenge everything their world believed in? Was Akhenaten a visionary who saw something no one else could, or was he simply a man who went too far? And why did Egypt, a civilization so skilled at remembering, try so hard to forget him? Let's find out together. And if you're enjoying these stories from the heart of history, don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey. This is the story of the heretic Pharaoh, a man who sought to remake the world in his own image. Before we uncover his forgotten legacy, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Legacy of Empires, and hit the bell so you never miss a story from the heart of history. Picture this. You're the second son of the most powerful man in the world. Your father, Amenhotep III, rules over an empire that stretches from the scorching deserts of Nubia to the fertile valleys of Syria. Egypt is at its absolute peak. Temples glisten with gold, trade routes buzz with merchants, and the gods smile down on a land drunk on its own prosperity. But here's the thing about being the spare heir. You're not supposed to matter. You're the backup plan, the insurance policy. While your older brother Thutmose trains to wear the double crown and learns the sacred rituals that will make him a living god, you're just watching from the sidelines. Imagine young Amenhotep IV, that's what they called him back then, walking through the grand temples of Thebes. Picture him watching the priests perform their elaborate ceremonies, seeing them grow rich and powerful from the offerings that pour in like rivers of gold. The god Amun wasn't just a deity, he was big business. The priests controlled vast lands, commanded armies of workers, and whispered in the ears of kings. Some say they were almost as powerful as the pharaoh himself. Thutmose's early death, perhaps around Amenhotep III's 30th regnal year, meant that Akhenaten was next in line for Egypt's throne. Can you imagine that moment? One day you're the forgotten prince, and the next, the weight of an entire civilization rests on your shoulders. Death in ancient Egypt was never just personal, it was political. When Thutmose died, everything changed. The crown prince who had been groomed from birth to rule the mightiest empire on earth was gone, and suddenly all eyes turned to his younger brother. A co-regency, where father and son ruled together for several years, was likely established to prepare the unexpected heir for his new destiny. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Most princes who suddenly found themselves thrust into power would have been grateful, maybe even eager to prove themselves worthy. They would have followed the ancient playbook: honor the gods, keep the priests happy, maintain the delicate balance that had kept Egypt stable for over 1,000 years. Not this prince. Something was different about Amenhotep IV. Maybe it was the shock of his brother's death, or perhaps years of watching from the outside had given him a unique perspective on the system he was about to inherit. Whatever it was, he wasn't content to simply step into his brother's sandals. You see, there's something fascinating about people who aren't born to power. They often see it differently than those who are. They notice the cracks in the system, the inconsistencies, the places where tradition has become more important than truth. And this prince, this unlikely heir, was about to notice something that would change everything. The priests of Amun controlled not just the temples, but vast stretches of farmland, workshops, and even armies. They had become a state within a state, their power rivaling that of the pharaoh himself. For a young man who had grown up watching this delicate dance of power, it must have been both fascinating and deeply troubling. But what really drove him to eventually reject everything his family had built? Was it ambition, as his enemies would later claim? Was it a genuine spiritual revelation, a moment when he looked up at the sun and felt something divine speaking to him? Or was it something more human, the desperate need of a young man to prove that he was not just a replacement for his dead brother, but someone entirely different? The answer to that question would tear apart the greatest empire of the ancient world and echo through history for thousands of years. Because this prince, this unexpected heir, was about to do something that no pharaoh had ever dared. He was going to declare war on the gods themselves, and his name would become Akhenaten, the living spirit of the sun disk, the heretic pharaoh who dared to imagine that maybe, just maybe, there was only one god worth worshipping under the burning Egyptian sky. Now imagine you're sitting on the throne of Egypt, and it's been 5 years since your coronation. 5 years of playing the traditional game, of going through the motions, of watching the same old ceremonies and rituals that have been repeated for over 1,000 years. But inside, something is building. Something that's been growing ever since you became pharaoh, ever since you realized that maybe, just maybe, everything you've been taught about the gods is wrong. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV outlawed the old Egyptian religion and proclaimed himself the living incarnation of a single all-powerful deity known as Aten. But let's step back and really understand what this moment meant. Picture the most powerful priesthood in Egypt, the priests of Amun in Thebes. These men had grown fat and wealthy on centuries of offerings. They owned more land than some small kingdoms. They had their own armies, their own treasuries, their own political networks that reached into every corner of Egyptian society. And suddenly this young pharaoh, this unexpected heir who was never supposed to rule, stood up and said, "No more." The pharaoh disbanded the priesthoods of all the other gods and diverted the income from these other cults to support the Aten. Just think about that for a moment. It wasn't just about changing religion. It was about completely reshaping the entire power structure of Egypt. He ordered the defacing of Amun's temples throughout Egypt, and he had their images removed from public places. But here's what makes this story so fascinating. In his 5th regnal year, he changed his name to one that better reflected his religious ideas. Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied. Akhenaten, meaning effective for Aten. It meant living spirit of Aten. This wasn't just a political move, it was personal. He was literally erasing his old identity and becoming someone completely new. Can you imagine the sheer audacity of it? One day you're Amenhotep IV, a name that honors the very god your father worshipped, and the next day you're Akhenaten, declaring yourself the living embodiment of a completely different deity. It's like watching someone burn down their entire family legacy and build something totally new from the ashes. But why the sun disk? Why Aten? Here's where it gets really interesting. The sun had always been important in Egyptian religion, but it was usually just one god among many. Akhenaten looked up at that burning disk in the sky and saw something different. He saw purity. He saw unity. He saw a god that didn't need statues or temples or priests to mediate between the divine and mortal worlds. Priests of Amun, who had the time and resources, hid statuary and texts from the palace guards sent to destroy them, and then abandoned their temple complexes. Picture that scene. Ancient priests, some of them probably older than the pharaoh himself, scrambling to hide sacred texts and statues before the king's men arrived to destroy everything they held dear. This wasn't just religious reform, it was revolution. And like all revolutions, it was messy, violent, and deeply personal. The young pharaoh wasn't just changing how people worshipped. He was becoming the only bridge between humanity and the divine. No more priests, no more intermediaries, just him, the sun disk, and the people of Egypt. The temples and the cities of the gods and goddesses were fallen into decay, and their shrines were fallen into ruin, having become mere mounds overgrown with grass. Within just a few years, a religious system that had lasted longer than recorded history was crumbling to dust. But here's the question that haunts historians to this day. Was this spiritual enlightenment or political calculation? Was Akhenaten a genuine prophet who had received divine revelation, or was he a brilliant politician who realized that breaking the power of the priests was the only way to truly rule Egypt? Maybe it was both. Maybe that's what made him so dangerous and so fascinating. A young man who had never expected to rule, who had watched the corruption and politics of traditional religion from the outside, who suddenly found himself with the power to reshape the world according to his vision. The priests called him a heretic. His enemies called him a madman. But Akhenaten called himself something else entirely. The living spirit of the only God that mattered, the sole prophet of the sun disk that rose each day to light the world. And Egypt would never be the same. What do you think? Was Akhenaten a prophet or a tyrant? Let us know in the comments. And if you're loving this story, don't forget to like, share with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more epic tales. Picture this. You're a pharaoh who's just declared war on the most powerful priests in Egypt. Where do you go when the entire religious establishment wants you gone? You build your own city, of course. And that's exactly what Akhenaten did. About 300 miles north of Thebes, where the mighty priests of Amun had ruled for centuries, Akhenaten found the perfect spot. It was a crescent-shaped plain nestled between cliffs, where the sun rose each morning like Aten himself emerging from the underworld. Here, he would create something Egypt had never seen before, a capital city dedicated to just one god. He called it Akhenaten, which means Horizon of Aten. Imagine the excitement as thousands of workers descended on this empty stretch of desert. Within just a few years, a magnificent city rose from the sand. White limestone temples gleamed in the sun, their walls open to let Aten's rays pour in. No dark, mysterious inner sanctums like the old temples. Everything was bathed in light. But here's where things get really interesting. The art that decorated this new city was unlike anything Egypt had ever produced. For over 1,000 years, Egyptian artists had followed strict rules. Pharaohs were always shown as perfect, godlike figures with idealized bodies and serene expressions. Not anymore. In Akhenaten, Akhenaten appeared with an elongated skull, a pot belly, and feminine hips. Some scholars think he might have had a genetic condition that caused these unusual features, but others believe it was a deliberate artistic choice to show his divine transformation. Even stranger, the royal family was depicted in tender, intimate moments that would have scandalized earlier generations. One famous relief shows Akhenaten and Nefertiti playing with their daughters under the sun disk, whose rays end in little hands reaching down to bless them. The pharaoh kisses one child while another sits on Nefertiti's lap. It's beautiful, human, and completely revolutionary. For the first time in Egyptian history, a pharaoh wasn't portrayed as a distant god, but as a loving father. Nefertiti herself became more prominent than any queen before her. She appeared in temple reliefs making offerings to Aten, something traditionally reserved for pharaohs alone. Some historians even think she might have ruled alongside Akhenaten as a co-pharaoh, which would have been absolutely shocking in ancient Egypt. The city buzzed with new ideas and artistic freedom. Poets wrote hymns to Aten that sound surprisingly modern, praising a universal God who created all peoples and cared for everyone equally. Musicians played in open courtyards instead of dark temple chambers. It must have felt like living in the future. But paradise has a way of revealing its shadows. While Akhenaten was busy building his utopia, Egypt's vast empire was falling apart. Letters found by archaeologists show desperate pleas from Egyptian vassals in Syria and Palestine, begging for military help as their cities were conquered by enemies. The pharaoh, so focused on his religious revolution, seemed to ignore these cries for help. At home, things weren't much better. Building and maintaining Akhenaten required enormous resources. Taxes soared as Akhenaten demanded more money for his grand temples and palaces. The old nobility, stripped of their traditional roles in the temples of Amun, watched their wealth and influence evaporate. Many of them had served Egypt faithfully for generations, and now they found themselves outsiders in their own country. The common people suffered most of all. While the royal family lived in luxury, ordinary Egyptians struggled to feed their families. The elaborate religious festivals that had once brought communities together and redistributed wealth were replaced by ceremonies that only the royal family could participate in. People who had worshipped dozens of gods for protection, healing, and guidance now had only Aten, a distant sun disk they could only approach through their pharaoh. Archaeological evidence from the workers' villages outside Akhenaten tells a grim story. Many skeletons show signs of malnutrition and hard labor. Children died young. Adults wore out their bodies building monuments to a god they barely understood. Even more troubling, Egypt's traditional burial practices began to change. For thousands of years, Egyptians had mummified their dead and filled their tombs with protective amulets depicting various gods. Now, these practices were forbidden. People faced death without the religious comfort their ancestors had known for millennia. The royal court itself wasn't immune to tragedy. Several of Akhenaten's daughters died young, possibly from plague or malnutrition. Their deaths were depicted in tomb paintings with heartbreaking realism, showing the royal couple mourning over their children's bodies. It was beautiful art, but it also revealed the human cost of Akhenaten's revolution. As the years passed, whispers grew louder in the palace corridors. Military commanders worried about Egypt's crumbling borders. Treasury officials watched the kingdom's wealth drain away. Even some of Akhenaten's closest advisors began to question whether their pharaoh's divine vision was worth destroying everything their ancestors had built. The city of light was casting longer and longer shadows, and Egypt was about to face a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of the ancient world. You know, there's something almost haunting about how quickly a pharaoh's entire world can crumble. Imagine spending 17 years building your dream, convinced you're doing God's work, only to have it all disappear like smoke in the desert wind. When Akhenaten drew his final breath around 1336 before Christ, the vultures were already circling. And I'm not talking about the birds, I'm talking about the priests of Amun, the old nobility, and everyone else who had been quietly plotting in the shadows, waiting for their moment. It's incredible how fast they moved. Within months, maybe even weeks, the systematic destruction began. Picture this. Teams of workers with hammers and chisels, methodically going from temple to temple, statue to statue, relief to relief, erasing every trace of Akhenaten's name and image. They weren't just destroying art, They were trying to murder his soul. You see, the ancient Egyptians believed that if your name was forgotten, if no one could speak it or see it written anywhere, then your spirit would die a second death in the afterlife. So when they chiseled away his cartouche, that oval symbol containing his royal name, from monuments across Egypt, they were committing what they saw as spiritual assassination. But here's where it gets really fascinating. The people doing this weren't random vandals. They were often the same artisans who had carved those beautiful images in the first place. Imagine being the sculptor who had lovingly crafted a statue of Akhenaten reaching toward the sun, and then being ordered to destroy your own masterpiece. The psychological weight of that must have been crushing. The new pharaoh, who we now know as Tutankhamun, yes, that Tutankhamun, was probably Akhenaten's own son, though he was just a boy when he took the throne. Picture this kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old, being told by powerful advisors that everything his father believed was wrong. Everything he built was evil, and that his very name had to be erased from history. Young Tut didn't have much choice. Within 3 years of taking power, he issued what historians call the Restoration Stela, basically a public announcement that Egypt was going back to the old ways. The temples of Amun were rebuilt, the priests got their power back, and Aten was relegated to being just another minor solar deity. Meanwhile, up north, Akhenaten, that magnificent city Akhenaten had built from nothing, was being systematically abandoned. Families packed up their belongings, loaded them onto donkeys and boats, and headed back to Thebes or Memphis. Within a generation, the wind-blown sand was already starting to bury the empty houses and workshops. But here's what gives me chills. They didn't just abandon the city. Someone gave orders to deliberately destroy the royal tomb that was being prepared for Akhenaten. His mummy was probably moved, hidden away somewhere we still haven't found. It's like they wanted to make sure he couldn't rest peacefully even in death. For over 3,000 years, Akhenaten's story was lost. When ancient historians like Manetho wrote their lists of pharaohs, they skipped right over him. It was as if those 17 years had never happened. The only hints that survived were cryptic references to the criminal of Akhenaten or that rebel, and even then people didn't know who they were talking about. Then, in the late 1800s, archaeologists started finding strange artifacts at a place called Tel el Amarna. Tablets covered in cuneiform writing, sculptures with an eerily different style, and fragments mentioning a pharaoh they'd never heard of. It was like discovering a lost chapter of history, buried in the sand for millennia. One of the most moving discoveries was a collection of letters, diplomatic correspondence between Akhenaten and foreign rulers. Reading them is like eavesdropping on conversations from over 3,000 years ago. You can almost hear the frustration in letters from vassals begging for military help that never came, because Akhenaten was too focused on his religious revolution to pay attention to Egypt's crumbling empire. But maybe the most intriguing question is this: did Akhenaten's ideas really die with him? Some scholars argue that his radical monotheism might have influenced the religious thinking that would eventually give birth to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Of course, this is hotly debated, and we'll probably never know for sure. What we do know is that the human desire to find meaning in the divine, to strip away complexity and focus on one ultimate truth, didn't disappear when they erased Akhenaten's name from the monuments. That yearning, whether you call it visionary or destructive, seems to be something that keeps surfacing throughout human history in different places and different times. In the end, maybe Akhenaten's greatest legacy isn't the religion he created or the art he inspired, but the questions he forces us to ask. What happens when someone tries to completely remake society according to their personal vision? How much change can a civilization absorb before it breaks? And is it ever possible to truly erase someone from history, or do their ideas have a way of surviving even when their names are forgotten? The desert wind still blows across the ruins of Akhenaten today, carrying sand over the remains of Akhenaten's dream. But every time archaeologists uncover another fragment, another clue, another piece of his story, It's like his voice is whispering across the centuries, refusing to be completely silenced. You know what's really fascinating about Akhenaten's story? It's like watching someone throw a stone into a pond. The ripples keep spreading long after the stone has sunk to the bottom. For over 3,000 years, those ripples have been reaching historians, archaeologists, and even religious scholars, making them ask the same haunting question. What if this forgotten pharaoh actually changed the world in ways we're still discovering? Think about it. When those first archaeologists were digging through the ruins of Akhenaten in the late 1800s, they had no idea they were uncovering what might be the earliest attempt at monotheism in recorded history. Here was a man who, 13 centuries before Christ, declared that there was only one true God. Not just one God among many, but literally the only divine being worthy of worship. This discovery sent shockwaves through academic circles. Suddenly, scholars were asking uncomfortable questions. Did Moses know about Akhenaten? Were the Hebrew slaves in Egypt exposed to these revolutionary ideas? Could the roots of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam somehow trace back to this heretic pharaoh who worshipped the sun? Now, I have to tell you, this debate gets pretty heated. Some historians are convinced that Akhenaten's monotheism was the spark that eventually ignited the great monotheistic religions. They point to similarities in the hymns to Aten and certain psalms in the Bible. They note how both traditions emphasize the universal love of one supreme deity for all creation. But other scholars push back hard. They argue that Akhenaten's religion was fundamentally different. It was exclusive, almost selfish. Only the royal family could directly communicate with Aten. Everyone else had to worship through Akhenaten himself. That's not the kind of universal, accessible faith that would later define Judaism or Christianity. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Whether or not Akhenaten directly influenced later religions, his story reveals something profound about human nature. Every few generations, someone emerges who looks at the complexity of the world and says, "No, it's simpler than this. There's one truth, one way, one answer to everything." Sometimes these people become prophets, sometimes they become tyrants, and sometimes, like Akhenaten, they become both, depending on who's telling the story. What strikes me most about Akhenaten is how modern his struggles feel. Here's a leader who genuinely believed he was saving his people, bringing them enlightenment and truth. He thought he was freeing them from corrupt priests and meaningless rituals. Yet his reforms brought economic disaster, social upheaval, and political chaos. Sound familiar? Throughout history, we've seen revolutionary leaders make the same promises and face the same tragic contradictions. They start with noble ideals and end up ruling through force, convinced that their vision is so important that any sacrifice is justified. But here's what really keeps historians up at night. Akhenaten wasn't completely wrong about everything. The old priestly system in Egypt had become incredibly corrupt. The temples hoarded vast wealth while common people struggled. The religious establishment had grown so powerful that they could challenge pharaohs themselves. In many ways, Akhenaten was trying to solve real problems. His mistake wasn't identifying what was broken. It was thinking he could fix everything by tearing it all down and starting over. History has a funny way of showing us that revolutions often destroy more than they create. And yet, there's something undeniably compelling about a person who's willing to risk everything for what they believe is right. Even if we disagree with his methods, even if we think he was misguided or cruel, there's a part of us that admires someone who had the courage to stand up to an entire civilization and say, "You're all wrong, and I'm going to prove it." Maybe that's why Akhenaten's story refuses to stay buried. Every generation rediscovers him and sees something different. In the early 1900s, when archaeology was romantic and heroic, he was seen as a visionary ahead of his time. During the World Wars, when people were grappling with the dangers of totalitarianism, he looked more like a cautionary tale about absolute power. Today, in our age of religious pluralism and tolerance, we're asking new questions about him. Was he an early advocate for religious freedom? Or was he actually its opposite? Someone who tried to force his beliefs on everyone else? Did he respect the divine in all its forms, or did he commit spiritual genocide against Egypt's ancient gods? These aren't just academic questions. They cut to the heart of how we think about leadership, faith, and the price of change. When is revolution justified? How do we balance individual vision with collective wisdom? What happens when someone who claims to speak for God refuses to listen to anyone else? The sands of Egypt have indeed buried Akhenaten's city, just as they've buried countless other dreams and ambitions. But his questions remain as fresh and challenging as the day he first asked them. In a world still struggling with religious conflict, authoritarian leaders, and the tension between tradition and progress, Akhenaten's story feels surprisingly relevant. Perhaps that's his real legacy, not the religion he created or the art he inspired, but the mirror he holds up to human nature itself. Every time we read his story, we're forced to confront our own capacity for both vision and blindness, for both creation and destruction. The ancient Egyptians believed that speaking someone's name kept their spirit alive. For over 3 millennia, they succeeded in silencing Akhenaten's name. But now that we've found it again, now that we're speaking it and debating it and trying to understand it, maybe his spirit is more alive than ever. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what he would have wanted, to keep us questioning, keep us thinking, keep us wrestling with the eternal human struggle to find truth in a complicated world. The conversation continues, and in a way, so does Akhenaten's revolution. If this story moved you, like the video, comment your thoughts and share it with those who love ancient history. Subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more legendary tales.